Hey everyone, how's everyone doing? Good? Okay. So I am going to talk about something that's it's interesting because a lot of the language that we're using is quite similar. I'm going to take a slightly controversial perspective, I guess, in the sense that I'm going to evoke the ecological model in a way that it took me, and the backstory is important because the co-author, Jackie Olvera, is a sociologist, but not just a sociologist, she's an organizational sociologist, so she focuses a lot on organizational ecology. And in writing the first piece, it took me about 2 years to buy into it because so organizational ecology and agglomeration, urban economics and agglomeration, they're kind of in conflict in some ways. And so rather than using very kind of definitive language like, oh, organizational ecology is better, or it offers different benefits, we decided, why don't we look at how they complement, right? There's some complementarity that I think could be useful. So in this piece, so what I'm going to offer, and it's kind of important to see the trajectory to understand like how we came to this. We came to this because of 7-Eleven. And as someone who grew up in New York, I was struck by the emergence and proliferation eventually of 7-Eleven. I never saw a 7-Eleven except when you left New York and you're on like 95 going south, and you would stop and you would see this thing called 7-Eleven, but there were never 7-Elevens in New York City, right? So we are the home of the iconic bodega, and very proudly so. So when they started to grow in 2009, 2010, and I've heard, and there's a map that shows that they were there before, but you didn't see them at the level at which we saw them, I was really struck by this. I was struck by the 7-Eleven's plan. They have a plan called the Business Conversion Program, where they were trying to convert bodegas to 7-Elevens. So if you buy a franchise, it runs anywhere between $200,000 and $300,000. But if you're in an ideal location, and 7-Eleven as the corporate entity believes that it's an ideal location, you can convert your convenience store to a 7-Eleven for just $25,000. You too can win for $25,000. And so they also articulated what a suitable location is, right? So sites that have pedestrian and car traffic, proximity to public transportation, and so on and so forth. What we couldn't determine is how successful the program is. But we could see, but we could see kind of the growth of the franchise in the city. So in 2012, this came out in Vanishing New York. And there's also this quote referencing the bodega on the corner in the Wall Street Journal in 2012. And it says the 7-Eleven, and this is a quote from that newspaper article. It says the 7-Eleven hadn't yet opened when young Yu started to worry. Mr. Yu, the owner of Young's, for more than 25 years, contemplated sending 7-Eleven a plea for mercy, warning that its arrival could spell doom for his business, right? So again, it wasn't just me and Jackie that thought the proliferation of 7-Eleven was perhaps problematic for the city, or there's something imminent in terms of what that might mean for the convenience stores, but surely the convenience stores recognized. And so the store right next to this, it wasn't a conversion, but the store right next to Mr. Yu's store is a 7-Eleven that's coming, right? So within 2 years, that store closed. 7-Eleven's doing just fine, and it's also grown across the city. So this also came from the Wall Street Journal, but it's ended in 2012, and since 2012, we've seen even more growth of 7-Eleven. So this paper isn't really about 7-Eleven, believe it or not, but it is about this idea of theoretically about organizational ecology, and the general question is to what extent is the emergence of small corner stores regulated by the stores that existed there previously? Conversely, to what extent are the chain stores displacing the small corner stores, or are the small corner stores, do small corner stores beget small corner stores, right? And so we chose in this particular paper, and I'm going to talk about the newer piece, which is more of an exploratory piece that I'm going to it won't be as clean as everyone else's presentation in some way, but this piece helps us think about, well, let's look at this one sector and look at grocery stores, two sectors, grocery stores and convenience stores, and segment the data by chain and independence. And so we too use NETS data, and we use from 1992 to 2012 to really understand this question of where are our chain store, or I'm sorry, are bodegas being threatened by the chain? In addition to the proliferation of 7-Elevens, we see generally that chains in New York City, a city that is still over 90% of the businesses are independently owned. And yesterday we talked about what that means. I'm not really going to go into the definition of independently owned, but it means it's not owned by a corporate headquarters. We didn't differentiate by the number of employees, so it could be a smaller independently owned or a larger. But nevertheless, we were concerned with and interested in the independently owned business, but to understand that, you also are trying to understand, well, there's finite space in the city, right? So if chain stores are proliferating, what's happening to independent stores, and where are we seeing that proliferation? So the Center for Urban Future, which is kind of an advocacy, research, economic development organization in the city, they started, I think it was in 2009 or so, they started publishing this State of Chains in New York City every year. And you see this pretty striking growth across the 5 boroughs for all of the chains. Any business that had more than 3 or 5 branches in the city. And so I'm only presenting this to show that 7-Eleven is the number 11. 7-Eleven is 11, the 11th largest chain in the city as of 2017. Dunkin' Donuts is kind of ridiculous. It's 612 establishments, Metro PCS, right, and so on and so forth. You get the sense that, and it's showing us by borough.
I can't believe there are only that many Dwayne Reeds.
Only that many. Yeah, only that many, right? And I'm not showing Walgreens and so forth and all the others, right? But that's just one. So, as I said, the broad question was to what extent is the emergence of small corner stores regulated by existing stores of a similar type? And so then conversely, are convenience stores and grocers being crowded out? Are they crowding out independent stores, right? So what I would like to present here are some of the findings from that, and then kind of it's a nice segue to the more exploratory piece. So we found a number of interesting things. So in terms of, let me just give you just some other context, I'm sorry. 1 second. Oh yeah, because I said that we're using, I didn't spend a lot of time going through the literature, but we're using organizational theory, and the reason that it was a conflict is because our understanding, and someone that thinks about business, my understanding of business is rooted in an understanding of the markets, understanding of supply and demand, and that ongoing this there's this dichotomy, right? And so we say, is it supply driven? Is it demand driven? And sometimes we can say it's a little of both. With organizational ecology, the focus is not on either per se. It's really on things such as organizational density, right? And by density, what OE people, so it's easier to just say OE, folks are talking about is they're talking about the population, the number of establishments, and typically the number of establishments of a specific or explicit type. So in our case, it would be the number of convenience stores, right? So that's one theme that you have to kind of hold, that this is really about organizational density. The other is OE kind of deals with populations or sectors which are clearly defined. And we know that that will cause a problem when we talk about not just NETS data, but NAICS codes, because NAICS codes are self-selected by the business owner. So if from an OE perspective, you might think of car dealers, or beer brewers, and any brewer that brews beer would be of a similar population. Well, what does that mean when you're thinking of something like a convenience store? Well, it may have the 445, the other 3 digits, and be a convenience store, but so will kind of a green market grocery might choose to have a similar NAICS code, right? So there's some asymmetries there in terms of, well, does that fully fit in using an organizational ecology model? And Jackie argued, and again, this is why it took a long time, Jackie argued, yes, it fits, because that's how the business owner sees themselves. And that fits within an organizational ecology framework, okay? The other is another kind of proposition within OE is that and it's kind of similar. It's that the population is presumed homogeneous. So again, I just said that's a conflict because you may be a greengrocer, which is very different perhaps than a bodega, but there's enough similarity in theory to kind of group them together, to understand them together with regard to the organizational activity. And that's different than like industrial theory, where industrial theory really stresses the heterogeneity, right? So again, when we're showing what does an agglomeration framework or an industrial theory framework do relative to an OE framework, the underlying assumptions are different. OE also looks over a long period of time. So we have, in using NETS data, we're using 1992 to 2012 for this study, and I think we go to 2014 for the other. And you're essentially grouping all of the data and looking at the, not really change, but looking at trends over time rather than, over a 20-year period, rather than trying to look at year-to-year trends. Right, where economists might look at year to year. Here, we're kind of looking over time. And then the last assumption or kind of attribute, I think, of OE is that I argue that it under-attends to some of the spatial dynamics that, as a planner, as urban economists would say, are really important. So in a lot of the OE models, you would not see attention to the built environment, for instance. It's attention to the firms that are proximate to each other, but the built environment doesn't really play out. So when you have these differences in terms of how you would go about understanding what happens on a corridor, what you do with your co-author is the first article, they get to determine like what goes in the model, and the second article, I get to determine what goes in the model. And that's essentially what we did. And so this is the findings of the first article, and what we're showing here is something, and this is why I said, okay, this is one of the models where you're like, duh. You remember I said you're going to see a duh? Right. So the duh is that convenience stores, independent convenience stores, we see, let me back up for a second. Models 3 and 4. Oh yeah, new independent convenience stores tend to increase when there are some independent convenience stores already in the area, and they decrease when there's a density, a concentration of independent convenience stores in the area. That to me was like, well, duh, right? Because in agglomeration, we would know that there's a point, there's a threshold in which we would see decline because there's no more, it's a saturation, there's no more space in the market. I understand that as an economic or a spatial relationship where ecology would say that it's really about the organizational dynamics. However, when you add chain stores of the same type in there, we don't see any significant effects on the emergence of new independent, right? And this was robust for all, and this is just a truncated segment of the findings. We also included race, foreign-born population, the borough, a set of other and a set of other controls. But in terms of neighborhood structure, what seemed to be important in Model 4, we still see the robust findings with regard to independent convenience stores, beget independent convenience stores. And there's a decline when we look at the density of convenience stores. And again, the chain stores have no significant effect. But what we're seeing is that independent convenience stores seem to decline in areas that have a high concentration of Black residents and increase in areas that have a high concentration of Latino residents, and no significant, although it's negative, effect for Asian, and then a very high positive for foreign-born. And that makes sense in New York, right? Where are we seeing a lot of the bodegas? Where do we see a lot of these small corner stores? They're all over, but this is showing that they're in in Latino areas and also in areas that are foreign-born, a lot of foreign-born residents. Okay, so all of that led me to think, what does this mean when you start looking at other types of businesses other than the convenience stores? So in the second paper, which is still somewhat exploratory, and I'd love some of your feedback, I focus on coffee, drugstores, convenience, and hardware, right? And ask a similar kind of question, but the underlying question is, what types of environments are enabling or support the emergence of chain stores? And the chains are these types of chains. And using Net's data, you can do that. So the reason I say this is both about the ecology of convenience, but it goes beyond convenience stores. It's because this is about the ecology of convenience insofar as I'm talking about the saving of time, the reduction of space, the way in which people want to consume in a way that's kind of easy. I have a more sophisticated kind of description of it in the paper, but it's really about the spatial and convenience is understood as a spatial relationship. And so the question I ask is, what types of neighbors support chain, coffee, hardware, drugs, and convenience stores? In using Net's data, so I do use the 1992 to 2012. I look at the chain and independence. I include firm age. Of course, the sector is there. I use the longitudinal tract database, which is a panel database done by at Brown University, which normalizes the tracts back to, I think it's from 1970 to 2010, and they're normalized to the 2010 boundaries, I'm pretty sure, and include a set of SES variables like race, age, a set of age cohorts, college education, whether it's owner-occupied units, the percent of owner-occupied units, median income, rent, and so forth. I also merge in building data. So now I include the percent of retail area, and then the square footage, 1 minute, of the business, of the building, as well as a dummy variable for whether or not the business, the tract has a bid or not as a policy, right? Okay, and so with that, we find some interesting things. And I'll just go through this very quickly and then kind of leave space for conversation in terms of what this means for the main streets at the end. So on average, we're seeing that neighborhoods with chains, any of these chains, have more independence. So neighborhoods that have chains tend to have more independent businesses as well. These neighborhoods, chain neighborhoods, tend to be more white, so 45% relative to 34%. It's also more white relative to Asian, Black, and Latino. There are more college-educated residents. Overall, there's more building retail area. The percentage of the building that's dedicated to retail is higher in areas with change, which makes sense. And a lower proportion are owner-occupied, so 30, but not statistically significant in terms of the difference in means for owner-occupied. That's residential. So what does this suggest? I think for the last day and a half, I've been saying, I think we need to have mixed neighborhoods. We need to have neighborhoods that have some chains, not a preponderance of chains, but especially in lower income neighborhoods. What I was struck by is the number of chains in predominantly white, and they're also some higher income neighborhoods. So that is something that I'm going to tease out a little bit more. But for neighborhoods that are predominantly non-white and low income, chain is often the first entrant in terms of a lot of the types of services and goods and services that consumers want. They tip for the everyday services, they tend to go outside of the neighborhood, right, to shop. So what does it mean when you bring a chain and that chain then stabilizes the neighborhood, allows it to become an anchor, and other small businesses can then open? The alderman offered an alternative strategy, which also could work. But if you look at it from the perspective of what community residents want, they're saying they want at least some type of change. So the question that I'm going to leave with, given that I'm sure I used the minute, is really one of A number of people asked about, well, what is this Starbucks phenomenon, or what is this? What's happening with coffee? What's happening with some of these other, a sectoral analysis, and what that means at the corridor level. And so the question is really, what is? And I guess the question is back to you. Like, what is the future of our main streets in really dense urban areas? And if we take a position of, well, we shouldn't have as many chains, are we suggesting that the chain should be concentrated in certain areas, and in other areas we should have just independence? There are 44 neighborhoods in New York City, neighborhood by tract, that have chain but no independence. I didn't go into that, but they're interesting. Those tend to be disproportionately Black and Latino in Queens, in Brooklyn, and in the Bronx. But most neighborhoods have a mix, right? And so I'm going to end there. It wasn't my most elegant presentation, but nevertheless. Because this is still exploratory. I'm trying to figure out where to go with this as an analysis, a sectoral analysis using organizational and economic theories. Okay, thanks.